So I have a problem. I'm going to an event and I have nothing to wear. And I think that's part of the issue when you start out in historical costuming. Every time you delve into a new era or you want to go to an event, you have to start completely from scratch. Now, the event that I'm going to has an Edwardian theme, and I'm very familiar with the Edwardian era. I started my career in theatre costuming round about that World War I centenary period, so I did a lot of Edwardian World War I things. I know technically World War I is not Edwardian, but the same sort of style of dress. I did a lot of that in my early career, and I haven't really done any of that since the end of 2018, so I am ready to dive back into it. However, it's me! Of course, there's extra challenges. As ever, we have the mobility aid compatibility issue. Edwardian skirts generally are quite long and trailing and floofy and things. That's not going to work for me. I'm also probably not going to be able to make a long line corset or anything like that because I don't know, I don't think you can really sit down in those. I don't know how that works. There is also a financial issue. Everything you see me make on the channel is funded by the revenue that I make on YouTube and coffee donations, but that's the only way I'm able to afford to make particularly these big grand costuming projects that involve lots of fabric. So I wasn't expecting to have to make this costume, so I wasn't able to budget for it, which means things are tight. I'm going to have to try and make this costume for as little money as possible. The other element, of course, is the time. It's kind of a last minute get together, this event, and I don't have a lot of time to make this costume. And I'm possibly gonna have some freelance work come in, which obviously has to take priority because I actually get paid for that. Yeah, I genuinely don't know whether I'm gonna make it in time. Ooh, the jeopardy. So I guess you better keep watching and find out how this goes. So I've been doing a bit of research into what I think I'm going to need to make, definitely, and this is sort of the good aspect of this design.
If anyone is unfamiliar with my good, better, best method, I suggest you watch my Sewing with a Disability video for a more detailed explanation. But what I mean by good here is that this is the bare minimum I need to do to achieve a garment that I am satisfied with.
So I'm not going to make a corset, I'm not going to make a brassiere, I'm not going to faff about with petticoats, I don't think. I think what I'm going to do instead is make a princess slip, and these became popular in this era as a sort of corset cover and petticoat combined, and they were to help, you know, create a smooth line. And I think that's the sort of Edwardian look I'm going to go for. So I think I'm just going to make a slip and going to call the undergarments good, really.
I began by sketching out a rough idea of what I was going for. You can also see here I did a rough sketch of what I thought the dress was going to look like to figure out what style I needed the slip underneath to be. I went for a very simple princess seam slip dress with a wide boat neck that could be gathered down using insertion lace and a ruffle at the bottom. I also added sleeves to the design, but in the end I scrapped those as I struggled to find any surviving princess slips that had sleeves. As I was trying to make this slip for as little money as possible, I chose to draft my own pattern. So I started with my skirt and bodice blocks and then eliminated the waist seam to create a dress block. I then had to fight with lots of large bits of paper to trace off the various large pattern pieces I would need to make this slip. To begin with, I traced around the back block piece. I used my pattern master to help draw the straight lines as well as the curved sections. As I was doing this, I decided against making the slip in panels, as you traditionally would with princess seams, literally because I could get a similar effect using less fabric and paper by just using the darts already in the block. To transfer the darts, I used a tracing wheel. This leaves little indentations on the paper below that you can then go over with a pencil. It's a really precise way to transfer information and easier than trying to see lines through this heavyweight pattern cutting paper. Once I trace the back dress block, it's time to choose where to put my neckline. For this, I just make an educated guess. It's something you get better at with practice, but it is just a case of drawing lines and looking at it and going, yeah, that looks okay. Add the straight of grain and then work on lengthening the skirt portion of the dress. I'm going for a gentle A-line shape here, and I want it to be long enough that it reaches below my knee where the ruffle will add the remaining length. I label the pattern pieces clearly before doing the same again for the front. Because of the shoulder dart in the block, I ended up with a slightly odd dart configuration, but more on that later. As the front and back are just going to be joined with a strip of lace, rather than make a pattern piece, I just measure how long the lace strap needs to be. Then measure the front and back necklines and do some calculations to figure out the total length of lace I'm going to need. I then just write instructions for how much to cut on the neckline of the back pattern piece. And so with the pattern finished, at this point this project has cost me, well, so far nothing.
So this is the funny looking dart on the front of the princess slip. And so I was going to do a seam, and then I decided against it because I couldn't be bothered to seam the long skirt panels. So I'm just going to have a funny dart, I think, and hope for the best. Maybe I'll overlock the seam allowance down so it sort of becomes a seam. You know, quite often Victorians did things like that, a dart that you slash into to make work. So that should be fine. I haven't made the princess slip full length. It's about 60 centimetres from waist to hem. Which is about just below knee on me, and that's because I'm going to put a ruffle on the bottom, and I think that's just going to be a rectangle that I gather down. Nice and easy. Why overcomplicate these things?
With the pattern complete, I was able to start cutting out. I'm using this white cotton which has been in my stash for years. I actually think it was left over from a professional job and the company didn't want it back, so I might have gotten this entirely for free. Either way, as it came from stash, I didn't have to spend any money. If I cut my own patterns, I like to cut them as blocks, meaning without seam allowance, which I think is also sometimes called net, but whatever you call it, I had to remember to add seam allowance as I cut. With only the 4 body pieces of the slip to cut, I was soon onto pinning and sewing in the darts. To mark the darts, I had used a tracing wheel, just on its own without any carbon paper. This left very faint markings, but I didn't want to risk using chalk or a fiction pen on my white fabric in case it left a stain. As a result, I had to very carefully pin along my sewing lines as I couldn't really see them once under the bright light of the sewing machine. I followed the line of the pins as a guide for sewing, but as I was likely to alter the darts later, I wasn't too worried about it being super precise. Then I joined the side seams. I left 2.5 centimetres of seam allowance along the side seams in case I ever need to alter the slip later. I had originally decided against overlocking the seam allowances, but later changed my mind. So I played with the tension settings on my overlocker until I was happy with it, and then went back and overlocked each layer of the seam allowance separately. This was much trickier to do with the seams already sewn up, but I think it was worth it in the end. I had also left large seam allowances around the armhole and neckline in case I needed alterations, but I was happy with the fit, so I trimmed those down. I also then began cutting the fabric to make the ruffle around the hem. The width and length of the ruffle was simply determined by how much fabric I had left. I would have liked it maybe a little longer, but oh well. To get the rectangle straight, I tore the fabric rather than cutting it, but in places I was so short of fabric that there wasn't enough excess to grab hold of to tear it, so I had to carefully cut along the right thread and then carry on tearing once I'd got enough excess to grab hold of again. I joined the 2 panels I had cut, or rather torn, with the overlocker. This meant I could have a much narrower seam and lose less of the width of the fabric to seam allowance. It's also just quicker, and I still had the overlocker set up, and it was less effort than changing over to my sewing machine again. I then pressed the seams of the ruffle and the ruffle itself as it had gone a little crumpled and distorted through tearing. Then back to the overlocker to neaten both raw edges. To make up for the ruffle being a bit short, I decided to add some lace to the hem. I've had this broderie anglais in my stash for nearly 10 years, and it came from a charity shop originally. Again, like the fabric, I'm calling this free as I've had it for so long I can't even remember how much I paid originally. I'm machining the lace on right sides together. And then flipping the seam allowance up and pressing the lace down from the right side. I then top stitch the seam allowance to the fabric of the ruffle to keep the lace pointing down. Then it was time to gather the ruffle to fit the bottom of the slip. I turned up the stitch length on my machine and ran parallel lines of gathering stitches along the top edge of the ruffle. You can see here I've pressed under the top edge of the ruffle to get a neat hem to the top. As the ruffle was quite long, I marked the midpoints between the seams with a safety pin and made 4 lots of gathering stitches for each quarter of the ruffle. This just makes it easier to get the gathers even and makes it less likely your gathering threads will snap and ruin all your hard work. It seems I now decided it was the moment to neaten all my overlocker threads by threading them back on themselves using a darning needle. I'm not sure why I did this now, perhaps I'd just forgotten about it. With that task out of the way, it was time to pull up those gathering threads and machine the ruffle onto the hem of the slip. To make sure my gathers looked nice and pretty, I machined very, very slowly and used a pin to stroke the gathers into place. This helps them lie flat and makes it less likely you'll get weird tucks and puckers. With the ruffle on the hem, it was time to add the insertion lace that was going to act as shoulder straps and create a channel to gather the neckline of the slip. This lace I actually inherited from my great aunt, known as Tante Ingrid, so again I didn't have to buy anything new for this slip. I pressed under the overlocked raw edge of the neckline and machined the lace carefully along the folded edge. I realised when I got to the armhole edge that I hadn't really thought about how I was going to finish the armholes, or the front edge in fact, so I had to backtrack a little.
So I've been trekking along with my slip, so it now has lace around the neck. Yeah, I wasn't sure how I was going to finish the armholes, and then I decided to just turn it in and top stitch it. The other issue that I hadn't thought about was I didn't really cut this to have a facing or anything for the fastening at the centre front. It's one of the things I think I just forgot about it. I'm not entirely sure what went wrong there, but there was a moment of madness and I didn't think about how I was going to close this slip. So I've had to sort of fudge the fastening. Essentially what I've done is I just turned in the edge and put a bit of cotton tape on top of it. So now it looks like I've got a facing or a button stand or whatever, but it is literally just a bit of cotton tape top stitched on. And then at the bottom I just snipped so that it overlaps like that and there's a bit poking out. Not ideal, but it's not going to be seen, so I'm kind of fine with it. And as I had suspected, this project has gotten even tighter because I've just had a paid contract come in. Yeah, so for the next 2 weeks, I'm probably going to have to work exclusively on that and do nothing on this project. So I'm hoping to get the slip finished today. I've gone through my button stash and dug out my Tante Ingrid's lingerie buttons. I believe these lingerie buttons, they're like as flat as possible and covered in fabric. So I'm going to stick those on, going to figure out how many of those I want, do the buttonholes and sew on the buttons, and then probably call it a day because I'm really sleepy. All right, let's get on with that.
Now, of course, when doing buttonholes, you have to make a sample to check you're getting the right size and your machine tension is set up correctly. And it's also really important to make the sample using exactly the same type and amount of fabric as where you're going to put your actual buttonholes. So for my sample, I machined some cotton tape onto a scrap of my fabric to mimic my makeshift button placket. Once I was happy, I began sewing all those buttonholes. This is my old Bernina here, so I had no one-step buttonhole or memory program for buttonholes, so I just had to mark them as precisely as I could with a friction pen and concentrate really hard. With all the sewing done, I could trim my threads and iron away the friction pen. As I had previously feared, it didn't disappear completely, so I'm really glad I didn't use it for the darts. I cut the buttonholes open and then began lining everything up precisely to make sure I was going to sew my buttons on in exactly the right place. I used pins to mark the placement for the buttons after my experience with the not-so-removable friction pen. Then all I had to do was sew the buttons on and the slip was complete. As you can probably tell by the decorations, this project was actually finished last October, and it came together in about 3 days. But 3 days for me is probably only about a maximum of 8 hours sewing, so I would say it was very quick and easy to make. The fit isn't perfect, it gapes over the stomach, but I needed the fit to be snug over the hips, so I'm not sure how to combat that. Maybe I'll add a hook. All in all, I really like this slip. It's quite simple, there are definitely frillier Edwardian underthings that survive, but this one is a bit more everyday, and I'm okay with that. This is the kind of project that I'd file under, does the job. Is it the best thing I've ever made? No. Is it an extraordinary feat of design and engineering? No, but I needed a slip to go under an Edwardian dress, and now I have one. So now I can focus my time and energy on actually making the dress. I might have gotten this slip together in a few hours, but will the dress be finished in time for the event? That's going to be my next video, so I guess you'd better subscribe to see how that turns out. Thanks for watching, see you next time.